It was 2 years ago when I collected seeds from this stunning wild population of New England aster along a local highway. I've been anxiously awaiting their display again this fall, but here's that same patch this year. In my first ever YouTube video, I worked to collect seeds from these flowers, and here's the reason I gave for doing this.
Our wild spaces are simply disappearing. And who knows when these flowers I pass by every day will be next to be mowed or sprayed.
Now I do know. It would be just 2 years later that these gorgeous plants would be sprayed, before they could even bloom. The first time I'd ever heard of plant rescue was when I stumbled across a small garden channel called S&K Wildflower Rescue Wildlife Habitat. The channel owner, Steve, would rescue native plants from construction sites that were about to have the land cleared, and he'd rehome the plants that he'd rescued in his beautiful gardens. Our current gardening culture has a tendency to treat plants like they're simple objects meant for decoration. But finding Steve's gardens and seeing what he was doing, it felt like he opened a door that I hadn't even realized was closed. And I could slowly step out into a world where gardening was far more connected and way more fulfilling.
That's random.
Before finding Steve's channel, I believed that plants came from a garden center. And of course, many of them can and do. But our gardens can also become a place for plant conservation. And we can become conservationists. One of my most exciting wild plant finds this summer was in a ditch I pass by every day on my commute. For reference, I'm in Maryland, but this plant was named North Carolina Wildflower of the Year back in 1997. It's a native hibiscus, Hibiscus moschutos, that I happened to catch in bloom this summer. This patch was blooming mostly in white, but the color can actually vary from white all the way to a deep pink. Here I am trying to find one of the deep pink flowers that I swear I saw blooming just the day before. Never found it, maybe next year, but after first seeing this big patch of blooms, I check back every week or two to get eyes on the seed pods, waiting for them to turn from a fresh green color to a dried brown. That's when the seeds have matured and are ready to harvest. The main reason any of these plants exist here at all is that they're in a ditch, and ditches are hard to mow. But the continued existence of any of the wild plants we pass by is really at the mercy of whoever's managing the land they're on. And what's kind of crazy is that many of these wild plant species are actually available for sale. So we've clearly assigned them economic value and even consider these good plants for a garden. But that's not enough to spare them. And even though we can buy these plants, one of the really valuable things we can do as gardeners and amateur conservationists is to preserve plants with genetics that are from our local regions. Genetic diversity is absolutely essential to a stable, healthy ecosystem. But we're losing diversity at a scary rate, and in some cases, we're doing it on purpose. In the conventional garden setting, our plant species often have their genetic diversity intentionally reduced or even totally bred out because we're selecting for specific plant varieties and cultivars, both of which require the isolation of specific and limited plant genetics in order to produce traits that are different from the standard wild species. Sometimes we're selecting for bloom shape or color, or even foliage color. Other times it's a compact plant size, but whatever trait we're isolating, it requires limiting the plant genetics in order to reliably repeat that trait. And our gardens are actually really important spaces to be adding diversity, because outside of our garden spaces, genetic diversity is being rapidly lost through things like habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation, imbalanced herbivore populations, and invasive species, just to name a few. As wild plant populations get smaller and more isolated from each other, they're less and less able to cross-pollinate and mix up their beautiful gene pools. But the biological variation that exists when we do have genetic diversity is exactly the thing that allows species to adapt to changes in their environment. And here's where you and I can make ourselves really useful. If you look at some of the problems I listed, then you can see how our gardens can at least provide some relief from these biodiversity losses, and maybe even become positive contributors to biodiversity. And I've discovered that a garden that includes plants original to your region makes for an extremely fulfilling and enriching garden. Since I started gardening more like Steve, I've found I feel more connected to my garden, and more connected to the bugs and wildlife that are using it. Some of you have mentioned having a sense of spirituality in witnessing nature unfolding in the garden, and I totally get that feeling. I have it too. Aldo Leopold said in his Marshland Elegy, Our ability to perceive quality in nature begins, as in art, with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. I too am discovering that language is often at a loss when it comes to describing the depth and connectedness of nature, including human nature. What's wonderful about conservation in the garden is that you don't always have to venture very far to find plants who need a helping hand. I'm traveling just out front of my yard here to another roadside ditch. This small space is packed full of plants, maybe about 50-50 native versus non-native species. It gets trimmed and mowed intermittently throughout the year, so it's hard for these plants to reliably bloom and produce seeds or fruit. So that means their wildlife value is more limited than it should be. One native plant that's in this ditch is heath aster, which gives me a chuckle because I was getting ready to buy this beautiful plant from a plant nursery. And here it is in a ditch not 10 yards from my house. It's an important late fall bloomer that I've noticed is beloved by green bees of several species. So is this plant in need of conservation? Let's ask the Merriams and Webster. By definition, conservation is the careful preservation and protection of something, especially planned management of a natural resource to prevent exploitation, destruction, or neglect. Well, in terms of this specific plant here in this ditch, between the mowing and the overcrowding with non-native species, it's likely finding itself caught here between destruction and neglect. In terms of this plant species, we can check the conservation status to see how it's doing. The Kew Plants of the World database is one resource that can be useful both to check a plant's native range and its global conservation status. But regional conservation status is also really important to check. If you're in the US, then you can check regional conservation status using BONAP's North American Plant Atlas. They have detailed maps showing conservation status for many plant species in the US. It's really an incredible resource. Looking at the map for this heath aster, we can see it's widespread and doing well, until we get over to the East Coast where it's actually recorded as becoming rare and even extirpated or locally extinct in some regions. Some of these areas are not very far from me, so she's going in the garden. I propagated this one last year and it's just come into bloom this fall as almost every other flower in my garden has been wrapping up, and it's been met with a very excited and hungry welcoming party of pollinators. After the weeks of rough weather on the East Coast this fall, I've been wondering if there were still pollinators that survived that would be looking for food sources. But as soon as the weather cleared, they were out, and I was grateful this plant was blooming for them. Also in this ditch is what appears to be spotted St. John's wort, Hypericum punctatum. You can see from how many maps there are in BONAP under the genus Hypericum that there are many species of St. John's wort, and some of them are non-native and even registered as invasive in the US. So it's important to really validate my species ID on this one. If you're using a plant ID app, you might discover your plant has a lookalike species if the app recommends two very similar species. My species here could be confused with Hypericum perforatum, which is invasive. If you're struggling to verify a plant ID, you can also do a search with the two similar species names and a versus thrown in there. And this will often give some helpful tips on what to look for to distinguish lookalikes. It says here I can check the dotted and lined markings on the petals and sepals. The native Hypericum punctatum should have sepals with abundant black dots and lines.
What is a sepal? Oh.
I took the videos of this plant about a month ago, so we'll need to find a shot with the sepals showing. Okay, barely got one here, but looks like we have spots. I think she's the native Hypericum punctatum. Once you find a species you think you'd like to conserve, what do you do next? Well, one very important thing is that we should never dig up a plant from a wild space, with very limited exceptions, which I'll talk about in a minute. Of course, digging up a plant from the wild removes it from its natural community, which is not our goal, and wild plant communities are incredibly important to keep intact. Digging is traumatic to a plant, and it's not guaranteed to survive a transplant. Any digging or soil disruption disturbs the soil's seed bank, potentially and unfortunately likely activating invasive species that could then grow into the area and crowd out the very native plants we're trying to conserve. The North American Native Plant Society has a page on this topic that is absolutely worth reading, and I'll quote from them. Plant rescues, meaning digging plants up, are a last resort to salvage a few vestiges of what is about to be destroyed. The interrelationships between plant communities and wildlife are thousands of years in development and cannot be recreated in our backyards merely by transplanting a few species. A plant rescue, again meaning digging, is not a triumph. It is an admission of failure to protect these habitats. They give some best practices for when a plant rescue is performed, but this is a very specialized case of conservation, best left to experts whenever possible. The only exceptions I would make for myself personally are, first, if a plant is on my own property, like when I have a native volunteer, I'll often transplant it into a garden bed where it can avoid the mower and get better suited light conditions. And second, if I were to see a plant facing imminent destruction, such as plants in the immediate path of digging for construction. This was a situation that led Steve to do plant rescues on his channel. Outside of those specific scenarios, I recommend the least invasive methods of conservation, which is usually to harvest seeds for propagation. Starting plants from seed can be tricky, but there are a number of resources to help, and we'll get better the more we practice. Back in that very first video I mentioned at the beginning, that was my very first attempt at local plant conservation. I was going for 4 different plant species. Of course, first we have that absolutely gorgeous deep purple New England aster, and second was this cheery yellow woodland sunflower. While both were alongside local highways, the sunflower was in a much less safe location for me to access, and we'll come back to this safety topic. While those 2 were highway plants, this boneset and this goldenrod were actually volunteers in my garden, but just not exactly where I wanted them. So I propagated them from seed as well to transplant to better spots around the garden. The boneset and goldenrod germinated very readily using a winter sowing technique that I covered in that first video. And I gotta say that I particularly loved watching the boneset in my garden this summer. It was just smothered in pollinators of every kind. And now it's coming into its beautiful fall color. Sadly, the New England aster and woodland sunflower have been trickier for me to get going in my garden. The New England aster germinated well, and I had strong little sprouts ready to go into the garden. And then sadly, my baby transplants did not survive our groundhog family. This is the first time they've managed to kill any of my plants. So I'm hugely disappointed and frustrated. But I've now learned the power of the groundhog. And I'm going to try again this year, and I'll take extra care to protect my baby plants. As I mentioned before, none of these original New England asters are blooming where they were the past 2 years. So sad, there were dozens of plants here. But these clever little plants did manage to hop the highway, and just a few are growing now on the other side. I have some leftover seeds from my first try, going on 2 years ago now. So I'll go ahead and try my old seed again this year with lots of fingers crossed. And I'll also try gathering fresh again from this remaining group of plants, assuming nobody mows them, running out of fingers. Another disappointment was that not a single one of my woodland sunflower seeds germinated. I think I collected them too late in the season, and they were maybe affected by a fungus or something. While I do still pass by this plant along the local highway, I don't think I'm going to risk seed collection again. Shortly after my first attempt, I saw a memorial cross just a few tens of feet from where I'd been standing to collect seeds the first time. So sadly, I think there was a fatal accident here. Which leads me to the less fun but very important topic of risks and safety. Bear with me, I'll keep it quick. According to safety statistics, roadsides are not a super safe place to be. Trust your gut. If an area feels unsafe, it's just not worth the risk. Never try roadside collection in the dark, and even in the day, wear bright colors. You can even get some of those orange reflective safety triangles. Look for ones with a weighted base to help keep them from blowing over. Be extra mindful of stopping on top of a hill or along a curved road, and it's statistically safer to avoid roadside collection on Fridays and weekends and instead plan for early to midweek. And finally, I personally don't love doing this alone and feel safer if I'm with someone. And I'd also feel better about you going out on your adventures if you can round up a plant conservation partner too. Fortunately, I've spotted another woodland sunflower this fall that's growing right along a walk we like to take in our neighborhood, so I can safely try again for seeds this year. Gardening with plant conservation mixed in has become a beautiful and connected experience for me, and I have Steve to thank for that. He feels like a role model and a mentor, which makes this next part hard to talk about. Sadly, just as I was discovering Steve's channel, this world was losing him to ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. Steve had a profound influence on the people who watched him. After watching just a few videos, he truly transformed the way I see gardening and what it can mean to be a gardener. I didn't have a channel of my own at the time, but I think continuing to share his message was one of the big inspirations, driving me to start a channel of my own. I hadn't realized it until making this video now, but when I was out collecting those wild seeds for the first time, Steve had just lost his valiant fight with ALS 1 month before. It gives me some small comfort to know that as Steve was leaving this world, at least one little person was trying to continue in his footsteps. I so wish I could have met Steve. But he's definitely left the world a better place than he found it. And I'm so grateful he opened the door for me to see gardening differently. Steve's final videos are made with text only, as ALS took his speech. But he could still write beautifully, and before he passed, his family made this video to celebrate his life and the gardens and family he loved so much. If you never had the chance to meet Steve's channel, or to see his lovely warm personality, I hope you'll watch this video next. As for me, I'll soon be working to germinate all these seeds I've collected, and I'll see you back then. Hoping you're safe and well wherever you are.